So why don't I start with an introduction? So my name is Dr. Shawna Pandya. I am Canadian, so I appreciate that it's very late for many of you or later. So thanks for making the time. So my background is, it honestly depends on the day. For anyone who's a fan of Forrest Gump, I say my life is like a box of chocolates because you never know what you're going to get. So on any given day, I'm a practicing clinician in general practice and rural ER. I am the director of the International Institute of Astronautical Sciences Space Medicine Group. I am also a scientist-astronaut candidate with Project PoSSUM and the International Institute of Astronautical Sciences. I teach an operational space medicine course. I teach technology and the future of medicine and exponential thinking and innovation mindsets, which I think will be interesting to some of you. Like many of you, I'm a mentor with several groups of students in the space sector. So I'm currently mentoring two groups to develop high school groups to develop payloads for suborbital flight and parabolic flight. I'm an explorer, an aquanaut, a pilot in training, skydiver, scuba diver, and there's so much more that we could talk about. But I think, Nikki, that you wanted to have a bit of a conversation for the first half an hour and then turn it over to the group for questions. So I'm happy to have that conversation and then figure out how we can best serve your needs and meet those objectives that you have all stated today.
Yeah, it would be interesting to hear from you, from your journey and from your visions and why you think your work is important, and go deeper into your work, into
Sure.
one of your many.
Yeah, I think there's so many threads that we could take that from. So what I'd like to start is kind of from that similar base of exponential thinking that many of you have mentioned and have embraced, and then tie that into my current work in medicine, space, and space medicine, as well as spin-off technologies that benefit Earth. So like many of you, I have ties to Singularity University. That's how I met Daniel Kraft. I was in the first ever class that ever went through that institution. Is anyone here unfamiliar with Singularity SU and what that means? Most people. Oh, okay, sure. So let me introduce that. So Singularity University is an institution that's based in Silicon Valley. When it started, it was backed by NASA, Ames, and Google, and the whole premise was to positively impact 1 billion people in 10 years using accelerating technology. So small challenge. So we would focus on things like climate change, clean water, energy, big problems. And this was in 2009. Some of you may be familiar with Peter Diamandis. So he was one of the founders of the university, really embraced that exponential thinking, as well as ideas for bringing transformative growth. And the reason I came to this institution is because I'd done my master's at the International Space University. And that's Peter was one of the founders there. It was a transformational experience that kind of led to my internship at the European Astronaut Center, part of the European Space Agency, as well as later at Johnson Space Center at NASA. And that's how I arrived at Singularity. And so I think most of you will agree that when you're with the right group of people, there's no challenge that's too big, and you can actually even think beyond massive challenges. And so I met up with a group of people who said, well, what if we can positively impact 7 billion people in 10 years using exponential technologies? And when we looked at that problem space, to us, the answer was natural and man-made disasters. And we thought that what is something that could impact anyone, anywhere, anytime? And that's how we came up with that answer. And this is just as smartphones were becoming increasingly pervasive and prevalent, and that geolocation aware notifications were a thing. And so we actually created a company and software at the time that could send and enable offices of emergency management to send out location-specific messaging to various groups, citizens, in times of crisis. And so that was kind of my first foray into entrepreneurship and embracing this idea of big ideas, exponential thinking, and turning that into reality. You know, we had good talks with the White House Office of Communications. We ran a pilot in Texas. We talked with the UN Emergency Group of Telecommunications. We were named one of Fast Company's top 100 companies. Then this was my other life. This was while I was finishing medical school. And so this, before long, that was my first foray into startup world. I eventually left to go back to medicine and complete my training. And as you kind of have gleaned, no doubt, that space medicine was also a huge part of my life. And as I finished my training, I really wanted to come back to that world and see how I could make an impact both on Earth and both in the space sector. So this is a very circuitous way of coming back to your initial question, Nikki, of what is my work today and how am I impacting the world? So I'm currently with my second startup. I'm with Luxsonic Technologies. We develop virtual reality, augmented reality, immersive technologies for medical education and training, both for space and for Earth and austere environments. When we look at the commonalities between space and say a remote village in northern Canada or a rural and remote village in Kenya, we talk about being remote and resource limited and needing to deal with the constraints of that environment. So when we talk about packing for space, we talk about needing to be mass constrained, volume constrained, power constrained, having something that has a long shelf life and is easy to use. And if that description sounds familiar, it's because we like those traits for resource limited areas on Earth. And so we're currently developing medical training modules in VR and AR for the Canadian Space Agency, but we're also bringing those back to Earth. So I have talked for a very long time. I hope that answers the first question, and happy to turn it back for further questions.
I'm curious to better understand space medicine.
Yeah. So when we talk about space medicine, if you remember nothing else from the session, it's that space is trying to kill you. And so when often people will come to me and say, well, space and medicine, how is that a thing? It just sounds like two disparate things. But when you consider what the spaceflight environment is like, it makes perfect sense. And so when we talk about the challenges of the spaceflight environment, we talk about the big five. And so the way NASA frames it is altered gravity environments, radiation, distance from Earth, isolation and confinement, and then everything else is lumped into hostile environments. So taking every single one of those things in turn, altered gravity. So every single one of us on this call, every 7 billion humans on this planet, every protozoan, every giraffe, every puppy has had the luxury of growing up in one gravity. When you take away that gravity effect, every single bodily system is affected, whether it's our bones, our muscles, our immune systems, our cardiovascular systems. And as we're learning through decades of spaceflight, the surprises keep on coming. In the past 10 years, we've named something called the space adaptation neuroocular syndrome. So what we know now is our central nervous systems, our brains, our spines seem to be affected by a condition that increases the pressure in the brain and in turn increases the pressure around the ocular system or the eyeball, resulting in visual changes. Just last year, it was discovered that one of the astronauts on the International Space Station developed a blood clot in their internal jugular vein. So the surprises keep coming. So that's just one part. That's the altered gravity environment. So, and that's strictly referring to the International Space Station, Space Shuttle, low Earth orbit. So now that we're talking in the international community with NASA, the Canadian Space Agency, ESA, JAXA, all the major space agencies, Russia, are talking about going forward to the moon to establish permanent operations and a permanent presence there and to Mars and beyond. So that begs even more questions because we have data from 1G, we have data from 0G, but we don't have a lot of answers about 1/6 G on the moon. If you weigh 100 pounds on Earth, you weigh 17 pounds on the moon, you weigh 33 pounds, 1/3 G on Mars. So how will our bones and muscles react there? So that's the altered gravity component. Radiation is the other big challenge. So On Earth and in low Earth orbit on the ISS, we're very, very protected from radiation. On the ISS, you're exposed to more radiation than you would be on Earth, but we're still within the confines of our Van Allen belts and the protective magnetosphere, which filters out the higher energy ionizing particles. So once you go beyond the confines of the Van Allen belts on the moon and beyond, you're exposed to solar particle events, such as solar flares, as well as galactic cosmic radiation. And so on the journey to Mars, over a 6 to 9 month one-way trip to Mars, you are exposed to the equivalent of a whole body CT scan every 5 to 6 days. So there's a lot that we need to solve about the radiation problem, because that can lead to everything from cataracts to increased cancer risk to acute and chronic radiation sickness. So then continuing along to give you a little bit more information about the other three components. So distance from Earth. On the ISS, we're close enough to Earth that there's not much of a time delay. By the time you go to the moon, it's approximately 2 to 3 seconds round trip communication delay because of the vast distance involved. So it becomes inconvenient to have a discussion with ground control on Earth, but not impossible. By the time you go to Mars, depending on the alignment of the two planets of Earth and Mars, one way it becomes 6 to 23 minutes of a time delay. So, 3 to 23 minutes. So 6 to 46 minutes round trip delay. So now imagine that you have a medical emergency on Mars. Someone's bleeding out, someone has a heart attack, someone has a cardiac arrest. You don't have time to wait for support or help from Earth. You have to be completely autonomous. So this is one of the challenges that we need to overcome as we prepare to send humans to Mars. And as you can imagine, it has implications for some of our more remote regions on Earth. So think about the most remote stations in Antarctica. Think about the most remote and austere military deployments in Afghanistan, Africa, elsewhere. Think about the remote Canadian Arctic. So then the last two in turn are isolation and confinement. So part of that is managed through selection. Astronauts are selected to be very, very team-based, very mission-oriented, have the kind of personality that everyone will get along with. No one wants to be the guy that's voted off the habitat. And as you can imagine, we have to extrapolate that into someone you can not just get along with for months, but potentially years on Mars. Imagine there's a conflict in the crew of 6 and suddenly the astronauts aren't speaking to each other. So you can imagine how important it is both to have that mission-oriented personality, have someone who's okay with that level of isolation confinement, and also the Earth considerations of, say you have someone with a spouse and 3 kids. Now you're asking them to leave them behind on Earth for years. What are the implications of that? And then finally, hostile environments, which lumps everything else. So that's altered day-night cycles. Here we have the 24-hour cycle. On the International Space Station, you're rotating at such a rate, or you're orbiting at such a rate that you experience one sunset, one sunrise every 90 minutes. So that's 16 sunset cycles over a 24-hour period. You have the stress of a very operational schedule. Astronauts are scheduled down to the every 5-minute mark on the ISS. You have, as you go further, the problem and challenge of lunar dust. So the lunar terrain is quite hostile. The lunar dust gets everywhere. It's a known irritant to skin and to the respiratory system. There's hundreds of pages of documentation from the Apollo missions of how the dust clogged up the joints in the spacesuits. And so this is kind of the quick summary, the 5-10 minute summary of how space is trying to kill you. But the bottom line is, these are opportunities for us to use and develop enabling technologies to overcome these challenges, to establish permanent operations beyond Earth, to become a multi-planet faring species, but also bring those technologies back home to enable both healthcare and day-to-day life on Earth.
I want to open up for everyone. I have a bad echo here. I don't know if it's me or something else, but unmute yourself. Ask Shawna.
Well, Shawna, it's Niall here. first of all, it's just totally inspiring what you're saying and blowing me away in terms of just I'm so excited about anything to do with space. So I'm feeding everything up, you know, in a big way. Yeah, you have so many different strings to your bow, as you described. And I'm really interested in, if you like, the space science, the space medicine side. And then on the other, I wouldn't say it's an extreme, but maybe it is. You know, do you see it as extreme with the startup activities at Luxsonic Technologies? And how many sort of lessons can you draw from one take to the other and vice versa?
That's such a perfect question now. I feel like it's almost planted. Yeah, so there's absolutely, so let me tell you about my origin story with Luxsonic Technologies. So the other part that we haven't gotten to yet is space is hard, space is expensive, and space is risky. You don't want the first time you ever plan or practice something or trial a procedure in space to be in space. So for that, we need extensive ground testing in similar or analogous environments, in that it's an environment that's analogous in some way to the spaceflight environment. So it replicates maybe the isolation and confinement, the resource limitedness, or the altered gravity environment. And so I have lots of analog experience. I've been on 2 rotations at the Mars Desert Research Station. So that's real life on fake Mars. That's a simulated Mars habitat in the Utah desert. It is, it's quite fun. The scenarios are it's austere. Like anytime you go out of your habitat, you're suiting up in your EVA suit, lest the Martian environment kill you. So I've been a crew physician, I've been a commander. I've also lived for 5 days underwater on an aquanautics mission. And you know, we lived, we did science, we did studies underwater. So coming back to your question as to how Luxsonic figures into that, that's actually my origin story with the company, because one of my crewmates on the underwater Neptune mission said, hey, I know a guy who does test cool technology. Would you be interested in talking to him about testing it underwater? And I said, sure. And so what we did was we sent an Oculus headset underwater with us on the Neptune mission. And I, as the crew physician, met in a virtual radiology reading room, one of their products, with the head of radiology in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada, 4,000 kilometers away. And together we reviewed the imaging of a simulated trauma patient from myself underwater and him, you know, in his office in Canada. And then a week later, because it was a busy week, we actually took that headset on parabolic flight and flew it in 0G to see how the CVERT software would react. Would there be jitter? Would the system work? And it did. And so that was kind of my introduction to the company. And then they applied for and got the CSA, Canadian Space Agency grant. And then they said, hey, we need a physician to advise us on this. Are you interested? And so that's, you know, there's a lot of overlap in extreme environments, because space is one extreme, but, you know, the remote villages that we talked about in Canada. And this is just one of many examples of spin-off spin in technology. I've written a book chapter on this, but you know, the water filtration systems on the ISS have been spun off to provide water filtration for villages in Kenya. Their deployable communication systems have been used in disaster scenarios on Earth. Solar-powered fridges have been brought to places where there's no electricity to be able to store and deliver vaccines. So, you know, when someone says, why indulge in space exploration when we have all these problems on Earth? It's not an either or phenomenon. We get so much out of space. And you know, I often say access to space is a form of empowerment. And our challenge over the next 10 years is to facilitate, catalyze, and democratize access to space.
I have a question. I spoke at a conference after Chris Hadfield, and it was fun to meet him. We met at TED, and it's kind of a fun guy to talk to. And he said, we're in the failure business. So every time, because I just got reminded to the sentence when you said you don't want to try something the first time when you're in space, you want to try it on Earth. And he said, I spent the whole life when I'm on planet, when I'm on Earth, I spend day in, day out figuring out what can go wrong. Every possible mistake that can happen should happen when we're on Earth, because when we're up there and we don't know any and the mistake happens and we don't know anything about it, we're fucked. Pardon my French. I'm curious if you can talk about this and also the process of being in the FADIO business.
Absolutely. So again, I promise this wasn't a planted question, but it's such a great question, Nikki. So you can see over my shoulder, there's Chris's book right there. Highly recommend it. It's called An Astronaut's Guide to Earth. In it, he talks about the power of negative thinking, right? So practicing for that. And I call that the what if scenario. You always, you know, as a physician, if you're in an operational environment, as a pilot, as a skydiver, you always want to think about the best case scenario, the worst case scenario, and the most likely scenario, right? And then you want to plan for those accordingly so you're not caught unprepared when that happens. This kind of ties into the bigger picture of resilience, psychological resilience, and what it means for us, whether we're astronauts or doctors or going about our day-to-day lives. And again, there's research around this. I've written a book chapter on psychological resilience for the long-duration spaceflight and austere environments. And so to introduce you to the concept, resilience is mental toughness, grit, fortitude, stick-to-itiveness. And there's this thought that you're either born being resilient, someone's more resilient than you, but actually the research shows that it's a trait that can be learned. It can be broken down into 5 key components. And why I bring this up is because breaking things down and mental rehearsal, as we talked about, the what if, the power of negative thinking scenarios, those are 2 components. So breaking things down, mental rehearsal, impulse control, positive self-talk, telling yourself that you've got this, as well as relying on your social support networks and enlisting those in your network who can help you succeed. And that's, you know, there's entire fields of psychology dedicated to this. It's what we call positive psychology. It's called, it's related to what we call salutogenesis, or people who seem to grow in the face of adversity. Why do some people live in Antarctica for 12 months, no problem? Because they have that salutogenic mindset.
Shawna, I have the question. There is an echo is happening. Okay. We build on the Mars some colony, and then we send 10 or 20 couples that they go there and they make their baby, and the babies are born in Mars, an example, and then they grew up there, and I don't know, 1 or 2 years old, how they will adapt to that condition.
Oh my gosh, such a great question. So again, I've written a book chapter on this as well. It's called Sexuality and Reproduction in Long Duration Spaceflight. And so what we know about zero-G from the mammalian studies, fish studies, insect studies, is that every single aspect of reproduction is affected, from sex drive, arousal, copulation, embryo implantation, development, gestation, and birth and development. We know that from animal studies. We have no idea what happens in humans. And that's, you know, something we're going to have to figure out. You know, Elon Musk says we are going to build settlements of humans on Mars. Well, settlements implies multiple generations. And there's actually a company out there called Spaceborne who initially proposed sending a pregnant woman to low Earth orbit, inducing her and having the first baby born in space. If anyone here has ever been involved with labor and delivery in some aspect, it is extremely high risk in 1G. So they quickly realized how fraught that was, and are now have pivoted to propose sending cells and embryos to be flown in 0G and study it in a more stepwise fashion. So coming back to your question, Suresh, of what we know that, for example, wasps who were flown and then came back to Earth, male wasps, their offspring had a higher rate of dying off than non-flown wasps. We know that the ocular lens development in zebrafish was negatively impacted. We know that in rats, their neuromuscular development was initially adversely affected, but then that effect disappeared after several months. And so the summary question is, what is the gravity prescription? How much gravity for what duration, at what dose, over what time do we need? And the bottom line is we don't know. We see it in science fiction. We see these kids who grow super tall by virtue of growing up in lower gravity environments, but then they're not able to come back to Earth. That's certainly possible, but a lot of things have to happen before that. You know, and the question is even the arousal state. The theory is that there, because of the fluid shift upwards to the head, there's less arousal in humans in space, but then you read individual autobiographies of astronauts who've flown who actually suggest the opposite. And then, so then with development, there's a consideration, well, if, you know, if we have 0G, is the embryo less likely to implant in the uterus and instead implant in the wrong spot, causing an ectopic pregnancy? So there's so many questions to answer. At some point, we're going to have to figure out an ethical way of addressing these in a responsible fashion, especially if we're committed to being more than a single planetary species.
I have a question about longevity. So that's a topic that, you know, in Singularity University, Peter Mann, he's always talking about, he's talking about longevity and extending human life for another 10 years or whatever it is, right? So I guess I have two questions. Number one is, what is the current length that a human can be in space safely? And then the extension of that, and what are the repercussions of it to human longevity? Because obviously there are no hospitals in space. Well, there might be one in the space station, but talking about like going to Mars. So what are the basic implications, or at least theories that exist around longevity in space?
That is such an awesome question, Ruben. Thank you for asking that. So right now there seems to be no ceiling, but the upper limit of time that someone has spent in space is that one of the Soviets had spent 468 days cumulative in space. And then Scott Kelly, you can see his book behind me called Endurance. He famously spent a year in space. It was a very massive study published in Nature. And what they concluded is that every single bodily and physiological system, from proteomics to metabolomics to cognition to molecular DNA, was affected. And surprisingly though, here's the thing, telomeres implicated in aging lengthened in space. That being said, we know that the astronauts seem to age more quickly in space. You know, perhaps it's exposure to radiation, perhaps it's the synergistic effect between the stress of their operational schedule, bones losing density and reflecting an osteoporotic state, despite countermeasures in the zero gravity environment, as well as the radiation. We know that there was some cognitive effect, an adverse cognitive effect in Scott Kelly. And we know there's cardiovascular stiffening as well. So the research so far seems to suggest that we need to better understand this, understand how much of this is a 0G versus 1/3 versus 1/6 versus 1G effect. What are the synergies between this and the other aspects of the spaceflight environment, especially radiation? What is the ceiling? What is the maximum time? And there's so many questions. So in terms of aging, we know that astronauts seem to age more rapidly despite what the telomeres showed.
Go
ahead, Marco.
Okay, sorry. So I have a more general question. First of all, I'm super fascinated by this topic. Alyssa Carson, for example, was one of my speakers at my TEDx event 1.5 years ago. So she's supposed to be she wants to be the first person to go to Mars. So I'm really fascinated by the topic. And I was recently listening to a video from Neil deGrasse Tyson. He got asked about, you know, how to make Mars a livable planet. And he said that basically it's way more likely and smarter to invest all the resources in making or keeping Earth livable instead of, you know, populating a new planet. What is your take on that?
Yeah, so Alyssa's great. She's a teammate. She and I have worked together through PoSSUM. So coming back to a couple of questions here. So you have to, I mean, there's a joke in the space program that says that the dinosaurs didn't have a space program, and where are they now, right? So we literally have 7 billion eggs in one Earth basket, right? An asteroid comes tomorrow, that's the end of it. We've had a good run and we died on not solving COVID yet, right? So there's the survival argument for being a multi-planetary faring species. So then the questions become, I mean, I'm not arguing against the ethical prerogative for planetary protection, both on Earth and both to any planetary bodies that we explore. You know, there's entire organizations dedicated to ethical moon exploration. So then the question becomes, how do we, you know, go about colonizing other planets? And this is kind of where I have a lot of fun thinking about this, because we are going to have to change how we do medicine. And, you know, it is contentious about who do you send to Mars? Because for me, I'm biased, obviously, but I think you need a crew physician when you don't have in situ medical capabilities, or sorry, when you have only in situ medical capabilities. But then the other part of it, and I think someone else alluded to this a couple minutes ago, is how do you develop those capabilities to become increasingly independent? And, you know, this is something that keeps me up at night. And, you know, what models do we use to establish that permanent presence? And I would say that we have some what's the word I'm looking for? There is some precedent on Earth, right? So at some point, there had to be the first baby born in Jamestown when the Pilgrims came over. You know, we established military hospitals. We established refugee camps and hospitals in those refugee camps. They're bare bones, but then you build up those capabilities, right? So then in what stepwise fashion? So NASA currently is proposing to spend 30 pounds of medical equipment for lunar missions. That's not a lot, right? There's a seminal paper that was just published by one of the European Space Medicine Groups on guidelines for CPR in space. And they said it's technically possible, but what happens afterwards? You need life support capabilities. You need an ICU, which currently isn't in the budget for the moon. So then in what fashion do you build up those capabilities? And then coming back to your question and alluding to the Neil deGrasse Tyson point is, well, then how do we hack that? How do we hack those challenges? And this is where we turn to ideas from science fiction and then bringing them into reality. Because what would be ideal is to circumvent the 6 to 9 month journey to Mars, to circumvent the altered gravity environment. So what if we terraformed Mars, right? What if we just brought another Earth with us? That would be the ideal case scenario. What if we could teleport to Mars? That would be the ideal case scenario. What if we could create artificial gravity, like in the space stations you saw in Space Odyssey 2001, or in The Martian? So we're not as far as we think from that reality. I am currently a medical advisor to a company that is building the world's first commercial rotating artificial gravity space station. When we talk about decreasing that 6 to 9 month travel time to Mars, Frank Cheng Diaz is a retired NASA astronaut who's proposed the Vasimir rocket based on nuclear propulsion technologies. So now with this technology, you could get to Mars in 39 days. We know that humans do well in 39 days of spaceflight. So terraforming is a lot more far off concept. But in the meantime, how can you enable humans to work productively on Mars? What if you gave them an exoskeleton? So even if their muscles and bones were atrophied, they could still do work. They could still construct their base of operations. What if you could upload knowledge to your brain matrix style immediately? And we're doing that through, in a way, through VR and AR. So the idea is, how do we close that gap between far off concepts that we need to help us survive and thrive, take those science fiction ideas, and then how do we bring that to reality?
Shawna, what's your... Shawna, it's Marcus here. Looking where you're looking and putting a bit of a crystal ball on things, in how many years do you think, at the current rate of progress, we'll have started to work out the solutions to some of the questions which you posed. One of those being, you know, travel speed, another one to mean comms speed, which I guess is governed by speed of light. So we don't think that it's possible to go any faster than that. We don't know, because it's an assumption there. When do you think, how many years do you think you'll see? We're starting to get some answers here, some really good ones.
Sure. So let me give you a real life example. So some of you might remember the 1994 movie Gattaca, wherein humans were genetically engineered, and then there was like this elite upper crust, and they were engineered to be superior and perfect and beautiful and intelligent. And that seems very science fiction. Well, in September of this year, the NASA and its collaborators published something called the Mighty Mouse Experiment. And basically what the astronauts on the ISS did is they flew genetically engineered mice, mighty mice that were engineered to have increased bone and muscle mass. They were literally these muscular, jacked up mice. And what they found is that those mice lost way less bone and muscle mass than their non-genetically engineered counterparts. And then they introduced a receptor blockade on a pathway that is known to lead to muscle and bone density loss. And when they compared the blockade genetically engineered mice, both flown and non-flown, they found that those mice actually increased muscle mass and bone mass in some cases. So the future is actually not as far off as we think. So now the question is, how do we adapt to that? I'm sure you've all heard the saying that the future is here, it's just not evenly spread out. And so then this comes to Ruben's earlier comment about longevity and prolonging life. And no one's actually been able to, when I speak to experts on the matter, no one's ever been able to answer my question of, we can overcome the physiological aspects, but how do we overcome the fact that we, by our very nature, our minds aren't set up to think exponentially? Like, why do we continue to make advances and leaps? It's because the next generation that comes after us builds on what they've been born with, and then they take it and run with it, right? So my best friend says that in 10 years' time, her 10-year-old is going to have to show us how to use the remote control because we just can't keep up with the technology. So coming to your question is, a lot of the solutions are here. People are working on it. I just heard about a company that's working on prolonged hibernation for long duration spaceflight. But what about the ethics? What about the acceptance? I think that the other question is the human and social component. How do we shift that to accept these solutions?
I have another question. It's not a question. Based on TED Life 3.0 and also Bostrom Superhuman, I think we will become near future superhuman, because Ray Kurzweil say 2035 we become a technical singularity, so we might have a special ability. So when we build the space station, on the Mars, the colony, and then we have Peter Diamandis has expressed the asteroid mining company. So we send the robot to build the planet Earth-like environmental, like in the Interstellar film, how they live multi-planetary species. Maybe it's a fiction, but I don't know if maybe reality. If we build the ecosystem like Earth-like situation, and children are born there, and they will look like different than us. Maybe their DNA and RNA will change or adapt or change, or we might have a different problem, but we don't know yet. When we start to do this kind of things, maybe we can live that way. And also the way you said, we should transcend our brain knowledge only outer space to live in a different format. I mean, we should not think like 2 hands and two legs or something like that. Maybe we will transform ourselves. I don't know. It's not a science fiction. I think it is possible because asteroid mining and also the singularity is nearing and all those things. When we put together, I think we might reach this ability. I don't know. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think whichever way we go, we have to be very mindful of the ethics as we go along, because anything that we do that has the potential to advance us also has the potential to increase the disparity that already exists between the have and the have-nots. We have with whatever technology we develop, we have to think about the unintended consequences. So no, with genetics, it's very obvious, what happens when you start selecting for desired traits, because there's a great paper out there. It's from the MIT review. It's called Engineering the Perfect Astronaut. And they talk about genetic engineering attempts to protect astronauts for long duration space flight. And their argument is it's perhaps more unethical to not genetically engineer an astronaut when you're knowingly sending them into this hostile environment. But then say that ability to alter humans comes down to Earth, and then suddenly we're getting into designer babies. And there's very serious consequences about eugenics that come along with it. Switching tracks, we talked a little bit about as we go forward to the moon, we talk about planetary protection. We talk about protecting the historical Apollo moon landing site. Well, how far does that go? Because at some point, everything on Earth is going to be a first. And if we're protecting every single first on the moon, there's not going to be left for more development. I just talked about the importance of democratization and access to space. We already have a problem with managing the traffic in peri-Earth orbit. And with that, the orbital debris that comes from both intentional and unintentional decommissioning of our spacecraft. And so I firmly believe that we need to access the spacefaring capability of all nations for infrastructure, for development, for Earth observation and monitoring, for telecommunications. But as we do, we also need to be very, very mindful about how we're going to go about managing that increased traffic. So we need to be thinking about the ethics of it all along.
So kind of related to that comment, I'm interested in learning more about or hearing more about ownership. You hear that Russia thinks they own Venus now. I heard somebody else laid claim to another planet like a week or so ago. So how obviously it's not, if there's one thing we know is that there's been conflict over land and resources on Earth, right? So how do all those rules and regulations apply to space now? Because it's the Wild West all over again, right?
Kind of, sort of. So there is precedent for addressing that issue. There is the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, kind of delineating, the moon is essentially like Antarctica. You can use it for scientific and exploratory purposes, but you can't lay claim to it. That is as good as the signatories, right? So I don't think China has signed on to that. So then, a lot of this has to come from goodwill and a commitment to the peaceful use of outer space, but we also need to be mindful of the ever-changing landscape. And so NASA and the USA just signed the Artemis Accords, but again, I don't think that China was a signatory to that. So now we have to think about how do we navigate that political and legal landscape. So there's precedent, but it also needs to be updated.
So what do you think? By the way, I love your stories, and it's really intriguing how you went up to this career that you've built. I mean, I brought a cake to my first day at the office, and you just went underwater on an experiment. So that's pretty cool.
I will say that it was one of my teammates' birthdays, so we brought him a portable makeshift cake. So there is precedent as well.
What I'm wondering, what I hear is that you're talking also about the benefits of the Earth. The work that you're doing is also very beneficial to programs on the Earth, which is part of being an exponential thinker. Is also like, how can we create it in a broader way? I see that within the extremists of the world in whatever they're doing, like for example, Formula One, which is a very high achieving sports, that the mechanics that's being designed there is also being transformed into the automotive industry as well. But do you see space experience and space development then also as being there for the benefit of the expansion of knowledge on the Earth itself? Or is it just about we need to expand outer space and explore other areas there?
No, absolutely. You know, there is a lot of economic and knowledge benefit that we get from having a space presence. So even if we got rid of, you know, our any exploration programs, robotic and human beyond Earth, if all we had left tomorrow was remote sensing, Earth observation, telecommunications, it's, you know, the economic benefit is you know, it's hard to argue against it. You know, emerging nations where, you know, in Africa, where they would have had to navigate tumultuous terrain to put in land infrastructure for communications line, have just simply been circumvented by doing the same thing with satellites. So having access to space is a superpower. So I think at the national level, there's an imperative to catalyze that in a mindful manner, knowing that that space is becoming crowded. You know, think about this. The space race started with Soviet and US race to show their economic superiority and the political superiority. And then by the time the early 2000s rolled around with the launch of the ISS, it was the big five. It was the European Space Agency, NASA, Roscosmos, Canadian Space Agency, and JAXA. Now, if you were to Google the amount of space agencies in the world, you know, there's 40 plus and counting. You know, the Indian Space Research Organization, UAE, Brazil, all of these countries are, you know, becoming spacefaring nations. So then let's take it a step further. What happens when space is no longer the domain of scientists, pilots, engineers? What happens when you increase that access for artists and athletes and entrepreneurs, right? It's just a whole new platform waiting to be opened up. And we're starting to see elements of this already. You know, Tom Cruise famously signed a deal to film on the ISS earlier this year. So, you know, I think there's a lot of potential for facilitating humanity's access to space. We see the suborbital commercial providers like Virgin Galactic, SpaceX, Blue Origin, and it'll be interesting to see how transformative that is globally.
I've got another question as well, if I may, Shawna, and it's about the, you know, what you described earlier on. I think you were very clear in saying that there's an incredible team spirit, and not the spirit, but the ability for teams to work together. And interestingly, I guess we see that, you know, conversely to perhaps the race for resources, the different national space programs, they seem to work very, very well together, far better than typical government institutions. Are there things that, you know, you could share with us about how we could translate that back into a sort of a corporate or organizational environment outside of these space communities?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And so teamwork is key. And to a certain extent, we select for those traits. You know, we look for people who are mission-oriented, objective-oriented, but also these things can be learned. And so someone earlier just mentioned ownership, and I thought we were going in the direction of personal ownership, but there's a great book out there called Extreme Ownership by a former Navy SEAL, Jocko Willink, and it's all about taking the lessons learned of being in a highly operational environment, in his case, not space, but you know, Fallujah and Iraq, and taking that into the corporate world and instilling in people a sense of extreme ownership. Coming back to my own lessons learned, so resilience and the key traits definitely formed a key component of that, but then just the lessons that I learned from my teammates. And so on my most recent Mars mission when I was commander, one of my teammates was a former Green Beret Special Forces in the US. And, you know, he at times was the most remotely deployed military unit in all branches of the US. You know, he showed us pictures of rural Africa that had been pure jungle before they came. And the lesson that he taught me was look for reasons to make your mission a little bit better every single day. So translating that back to your workplace, translating that back to the groups that you mentor is how do you teach you know, your team to break things down and look for ways to make things better, a little bit better every single day. And then the other part of it is I'm a huge believer myself in the principle that leadership is like a hall of mirrors. So anything, it's not just what you preach, it's not just what you teach to your team, but it's what you tolerate. And that's a reflection of yourself. And so if you, you know, if there's a suboptimal culture in your workplace, then that's a reflection of your leadership as well. And there's also, there's the economic argument for why. Why do you need to make your workplace equitable? It's because we know that the research shows when you have more perspectives at the table, you're more likely to succeed. But more than that, it's right. So when you empower all of the people on your team to work at their very best, you're setting up your team to succeed for the best possible outcome. So that's why I'm such a huge believer in both ownership at the individual level and at the leadership level.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. That's a great answer.
Don't you think that we have to re-engineer to be a human being, to not to be greedy, not to be power, to become a new human being, to leave the planet, to live somewhere else, as working together as a new society, because we have 4.5 billion years to go on this planet, and our sun will every day getting bigger and bigger. In 1 billion years, we cannot live anymore here. And Stephen Hawking, before he died, he said, we need one more billion years, but then he said, we have only 100 years to go. So what do you think that we have to relearn our ethics? I mean, re-engineer the human being.
Yeah, that's such a great question to kind of end our conversation on. So, you know, best case scenario, we have up to 1 billion years to get our act together. Worst case scenario, it's decades with the rate of climate change and the trend in which it's heading. So then that comes down to how do we need to change our behavior? We don't need to re-engineer our brains. We need to imbibe in ourselves certain key values. And I think you're alluding to one of them perfectly, is that the value of the social contract. None of us has gotten to where we are today without the goodwill of others. You know, even if you are the most individualistic human out there, you were able to get to your job because the government paid for roads to be developed, right? So what does that social contract mean to you? How are you going to give back to society? And how are you going to also instill that sense of social building in others?